A team of researchers recently sat down and asked Grok AI a single, deceptively simple question: who actually built the pyramids? Expecting the usual mixture of vague textbook answers and unresolved mystery that has surrounded this topic for over 2 centuries. What came back instead was named names, cited a 4,500-year-old logbook written by a real, identifiable man, and laid out a level of organizational detail so specific that it read less like ancient history and more like an actual employee record. The answer left the room stunned, not because it confirmed some wild alternative theory, but because it did the opposite. It revealed that the true story of who built the pyramids is more detailed, more human, and honestly, more impressive than almost anyone in that room had realized. Today, we're walking through exactly what that answer contained, starting with a man named Merer, whose personal daily journal somehow survived nearly 5 millennia to become one of the most important documents in the history of archaeology, and ending with a specific organizational system that allowed tens of thousands of ordinary people to build the largest stone structure on the planet. Stick around, because the detail about how workers were split into rotating teams and what happened to them when their shift ended is the part that genuinely surprised everyone in that research session. Let's start with Merer, because his story is honestly one of the most remarkable discoveries in modern Egyptology, and it's the centerpiece of Grok's entire answer. In 2013, a team of French and Egyptian archaeologists working at a site called Wadi al-Jarf, an ancient harbor on the Red Sea coast roughly 74 miles from Suez, uncovered hundreds of papyrus fragments buried inside storage caves that had sealed them away from the elements for over 4,000 years. Once painstakingly pieced back together and translated, these fragments turned out to be something extraordinary: the personal logbook of a middle-ranking official named Merer, who held the title of inspector and led a working crew of approximately 200 men during the 27th year of Khufu's reign. This makes Merer's journal the oldest inscribed papyrus ever discovered in Egypt. And unlike royal inscriptions or ceremonial texts, it wasn't written to glorify a pharaoh or record a religious ritual. It was a working man's daily logbook tracking mundane, practical details about shipments, schedules, and labor. Exactly the way a modern site foreman might keep a project diary today. Reading it feels almost eerily familiar. Dates, tasks completed, materials received, all recorded in matter-of-fact hieratic script by someone who had absolutely no idea his casual daily notes would become one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 21st century. What makes Merer's diary so valuable isn't just that it exists, it's what it actually describes. According to the entries, Merer's specific job during this period involved overseeing the transportation of high-quality white limestone from the Tura quarries, located on the opposite side of the Nile from Giza, to the construction site itself. Material specifically used for the pyramid's smooth, polished outer casing, rather than the rougher core blocks. His crew moved this limestone by boat, navigating a network of canals and waterways that connected the quarry directly to the construction site, with the journal recording specific round trips, the exact number of days each journey took, and the precise quantities of stone delivered on each run. This is precisely the kind of granular, logistics-focused detail that Grok's analysis highlighted as genuinely irreplaceable, because it doesn't just tell us that limestone was moved from Tura to Giza, a fact historians already suspected. It tells us how quickly it moved, how the transportation network was organized, and how a single mid-level supervisor managed a real crew of real workers executing a specific, repeatable task as part of a much larger, coordinated construction effort happening near the very end of the Great Pyramid's construction, when Merer's team was helping put the finishing touches on the outer casing. Here's where the organizational picture really starts to come together, and it's the part that Grok's breakdown treated as the true answer to the original question. Merer's crew wasn't just some random collection of men grabbed from nearby villages. They were part of a structured labor system that ancient Egyptians called a phyle, essentially an organized work gang that rotated through different assignments on a defined schedule, similar in some ways to how modern military units or shift-based industrial labor forces are organized today. Multiple files worked in parallel, each identified by name and overseen by its own inspector with difference. T-crews responsible for different tasks, depending on the specific stage of construction: quarrying stone, transporting material, positioning blocks, or finishing surfaces. This system meant the overall pyramid project functioned less like a single massive undifferentiated labor force, and more like a coordinated network of specialized teams, each with defined responsibilities, defined leadership, and defined schedules, feeding into a single unified construction timeline that stretched across roughly 2 decades. When Grok's response walked through this structure, it drew a direct comparison to modern large-scale infrastructure projects, noting that the level of administrative sophistication required to coordinate multiple rotating crews, track material deliveries, and maintain consistent progress across a project. This size represents a genuinely impressive achievement in ancient project management, regardless of the era it happened in. Now, let's talk about who these workers actually were, because this is where Grok's answer directly confronted and dismantled one of the most persistent myths in popular culture. For centuries, the dominant image of pyramid construction involved massive gangs of enslaved people whipped into backbreaking labor under threat of death, an image that traces back largely to the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt around 450 BCE, roughly 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid was already ancient history, and recorded secondhand stories rather than first-hand observation. The archaeological evidence tells a fundamentally different story. Excavations at a settlement just south of the Giza Plateau, often called the Workers' Village, uncovered an entire functioning town built specifically to house and support the construction crews, complete with large-scale bakeries capable of producing bread in significant daily quantities, breweries producing beer that served as both nutrition and payment in an economy that didn't yet use currency, and dedicated medical facilities where injured workers received treatment. Skeletal remains recovered from cemeteries near this settlement show healed fractures that had been properly set and treated, a detail that simply doesn't fit the image of disposable slave labor, since untreated injuries would be far more consistent with a workforce nobody cared enough to keep alive and functional. Perhaps most tellingly, some workers were buried in tombs positioned close to the sacred pyramid complex itself, an honor reserved for individuals whose labor was genuinely respected within Egyptian society, not treatment typically extended to captives or slaves. Merer's own writing reinforces this picture in a way that raw archaeological evidence alone can't quite capture, because you're reading the actual voice of a supervisor managing a real logistics operation, someone clearly invested in the details of his job, tracking schedules and deliveries with the kind of workmanlike precision you'd expect from any competent project manager, rather than an overseer of forced captive labor. Grok's response specifically noted that the tone and content of Merer's entries, practical matter of fact, occasionally noting delays or complications, read far more like the diary of a skilled professional executing a demanding but respected job than like any surviving account of forced servitude from other periods of history, combined with evidence that many workers were likely seasonal farmers filling their off months when Nile floodwaters made agricultural work impossible, with paid state labor on major building projects, a system some researchers compare loosely to a rotating national service program. The overall picture that emerges is one of organized, compensated, socially respected labor, not the whip-driven slave gangs that Hollywood and popular imagination have spent generations reinforcing. If you're finding this breakdown interesting, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep making deep dives exactly like this one. There's another layer to this story that Grok's analysis spent real time on, and it involves the sheer scale of coordination required to keep a project like this running for over 20 years without modern communication. Technology, without paper money, and without any of the tools we take for granted in large-scale project management today. Feeding a workforce estimated at somewhere between 20 and 40,000 people during peak construction periods, a number that includes not just the stonecutters and haulers, but also the bakers, brewers, boat crews, scribes, and administrators supporting them, required an agricultural and logistical supply chain of genuinely staggering scale. Grain had to be grown, harvested, stored, and transported in quantities sufficient to bake bread daily for tens of thousands of workers. Livestock had to be raised and delivered for both food and the leather goods needed for ropes and equipment. Beer, which served as a primary caloric staple and functioned essentially as a form of payment in kind, had to be brewed continuously at an industrial scale using dedicated facilities identified at the workers' settlement. None of this happens by accident or improvisation. It requires a centralized administrative system capable of forecasting needs, tracking distribution, and adjusting supply chains across an entire region of ancient Egypt, coordinated from a level of government sophistication that historians increasingly recognize as one of the genuinely remarkable, underappreciated achievements of the entire Old Kingdom period. This is also where Grok's response addressed something that tends to get lost in most discussions of pyramid construction, the question of who actually designed the thing in the first place. Because building it required more than organized labor, it required genuine architectural and mathematical expertise. Ancient Egyptian sources identify a man named Hemiunu as the likely architect responsible for overseeing the Great Pyramid's construction, a vizier and close relative of Khufu, whose own tomb, discovered relatively close to the pyramid complex itself, includes a statue depicting him as a well-fed, clearly high-status individual, exactly the kind of senior state official you'd expect to have overseen a project of this magnitude. Under an architect like Hemiunu, a smaller team of highly skilled specialists would have handled the genuinely difficult, Technical work, surveying the site with remarkable accuracy, calculating the pyramid's precise angles and proportions, and directing the placement of the enormous granite beams inside the king's chamber, work that required a level of mathematical and engineering sophistication entirely separate from the raw manpower needed to move and place 2.3 million individual stone blocks. Grok's breakdown treated this distinction as genuinely important, noting that the popular image of pyramid construction often flattens an enormously sophisticated, multi-tiered workforce, involving elite architects, skilled specialist masons, mid-level supervisors like Merer, and a much larger base of seasonal laborers into a single undifferentiated mass, when the actual historical reality was closer to a highly stratified, professionally organized construction industry with clear divisions of expertise and responsibility. Understanding exactly how these rotating Filey crews were named and tracked adds another surprisingly vivid layer to this story, because the Egyptians didn't just number their work gangs the way a modern factory might label shifts. They gave them names tied directly to royal praise and religious devotion. Some of the identified crew names translate roughly to phrases meaning something like Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkaure, playful, moral, boosting titles that suggest a level of team identity and workplace culture that feels remarkably relatable even across a gap of 45 centuries. These crews competed and cooperated in a structured rotation, with evidence suggesting each Filey worked for a defined period before rotating out to rest or return to agricultural duties, then rotating back in as part of the ongoing cycle sustaining a 2-decade construction timeline. Grok's breakdown treated this naming convention as genuinely significant, arguing that a labor system where workers took pride in a named team identity, competing informally with other crews and referencing their own leader or patron deity in that name, looks far more like an organized workforce with genuine morale and internal culture than like a faceless mass of forced captives with no stake in the outcome of their labor. The scribes and administrators supporting this entire system deserve their own mention too, because Merer wasn't operating in isolation. He was part of a much broader bureaucratic apparatus that Grok's analysis described as functionally comparable to a modern government logistics agency. Beyond the papyri recovered at Wadi al-Jarf, archaeologists have identified administrative seals, inventory markers, and quarry inscriptions scattered across multiple sites connected to the pyramid's construction, each one representing a small piece of a much larger record-keeping system tracking material shipments, labor assignments, and construction milestones across the entire project. Quarry marks, found on blocks within the pyramid itself, sometimes include the name of the specific work crew responsible for cutting that stone, a detail that functions almost like a signature, allowing modern researchers to trace which team handled which section of construction centuries after the fact. This level of granular record-keeping, embedded directly into the physical stones of the monument itself, is exactly the kind of evidence that makes the organized labor explanation so much stronger than any alternative theory, because it wasn't added later or reconstructed from fragmentary second-hand accounts. It was built directly into the pyramid's fabric by the very workers who placed each block, leaving behind an accidental paper trail that nobody involved could have anticipated would still be readable nearly 5,000 years into the future. It's worth pausing on just how differently this evidence-based picture compares to the version of pyramid construction most people grew up believing, whether from movies, textbooks, or casual cultural osmosis. Popular depictions almost universally show rows of anonymous, suffering figures dragging stones under the crack of an overseer's whip, a visual shorthand that's dramatic, cinematic, and almost entirely disconnected from what the actual papyri, skeletal remains, settlement archaeology, and quarry inscriptions consistently describe. Grok's response was notably direct about this gap, pointing out that continuing to default to the slave Lebo-R narrative despite decades of accumulated contrary evidence says more about the staying power of a 2,000-year-old second-hand account from Herodotus than about what modern archaeology has actually established. That's not a small correction either. It fundamentally reframes the entire achievement, transforming the story from one of suffering and coercion into one of remarkable organizational sophistication, skilled craftsmanship, and a genuinely respected, if physically demanding form of state labor that ordinary Egyptians appear to have taken real pride in participating in. So what actually shocked the researchers reading through this response? It wasn't a hidden conspiracy, it wasn't evidence of some lost civilization, and it definitely wasn't an admission that extraterrestrial visitors had a hand in things, despite how often that particular theory gets attached to any pyramid-related headline online. What genuinely surprised the room was how completely the real evidence, once proper, lay organized and cross-referenced by an AI system capable of synthesizing decades OF scattered archaeological literature almost instantly, dismantled the two most persistent myths about pyramid construction at once, the myth of slave labor and the myth of impossible outside intervention, replacing both with something arguably far more compelling, a detailed human, deeply organized society that managed to coordinate tens of thousands of paid, respected workers across 2 decades using nothing more than administrative skill, agricultural planning, and genuine engineering expertise. Mirror's diary alone represents an almost unbelievable stroke of historical luck, a personal record surviving nearly 5 millennia to give modern researchers a direct, unfiltered window into the daily reality of pyramid construction, written not by a pharaoh boasting about his achievements, but by an ordinary working supervisor, simply doing his job and keeping careful notes along the way. There's a final piece worth adding here, because it puts Mirror's discovery into proper perspective against the wider landscape of ancient historical documents that survive today. The vast majority of surviving ancient Egyptian texts fall into predictable categories: royal inscriptions praising a pharaoh's divine achievements, religious texts guiding the deceased through the afterlife, or administrative tax records tracking grain and livestock across the kingdom. A genuine first-person working diary from a mid-level government employee describing his actual daily job with all its mundane specificity is exceptionally rare across the entire ancient world, not just in Egypt. Historians studying other ancient civilizations, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, early China, would consider a discovery like this a career-defining find, regardless of what it actually described, simply because first-hand, non-royal, non-religious documentation from this deep in antiquity almost never survives intact. That rarity is part of why Egyptologist Pierre Tallet, who led the excavation team that uncovered the papyri, and his colleague Mark Lenner, one of the most respected Egyptologists currently working on Giza specifically, both described the discovery in strikingly enthusiastic terms when it was first published, treating it as one of the most significant archaeological finds of the 21st century, a status the document has continued to earn as researchers keep extracting new logistical and organizational details from its contents years after its initial translation. Grok's response also touched on something that rarely gets discussed in casual conversations about pyramid construction: the sheer engineering confidence required to even attempt a project this ambitious in the first place. Khufu's father, Sneferu, had already overseen the construction of at least 2, and by some counts 3, major pyramids, before his son inherited the throne, meaning the architectural and organizational knowledge required for the Great Pyramid didn't emerge from nothing. It built directly on real, practical experience gained through previous large-scale construction projects, including some notable structural corrections made mid-build when earlier designs proved unstable. This progression matters enormously to the overall picture Grok's answer painted, because it means the workforce, the administrative systems, and the engineering knowledge behind the Great Pyramid weren't invented specifically for this one extraordinary project. They represented the accumulated expertise of an entire dynasty's worth of ambitious building projects, refined and improved with each successive attempt until Khufu's architects, workers, and administrators were finally ready to attempt the largest and most precise version yet. Seen through that lens, the Great Pyramid stops looking like an isolated miracle and starts looking like exactly what it actually was: the confident culmination of a multi-generational engineering program executed by a well-organized, well-fed, and genuinely skilled workforce whose daily reality survives in remarkable detail, in the careful handwriting of a supervisor named Marer, whose ordinary working day, logged without any sense that history was watching, turned out to hold one of the clearest answers archaeology has ever found to a question people have been asking for over 2,000 years. What makes this answer genuinely more satisfying than any alien intervention theory, once you actually sit with it, is what it says about human capability when people are organized well, motivated appropriately, and given clear leadership and purpose. The Great Pyramid wasn't built by mysterious outside forces because it didn't need to be. It was built by exactly the kind of people who still build enormous infrastructure projects today: skilled architects working from careful mathematical calculations, mid-level managers like Marer keeping precise logistical records, specialized craftsmen executing technically demanding work, and a much larger workforce of seasonal laborers whose combined, coordinated effort over 2 decades produced something that still leaves visitors speechless 45 centuries later. The real story isn't smaller or less impressive than the myths surrounding it. If anything, it's larger because it means an entire civilization. Working with Bronze Age tools and a level of administrative sophistication, historians are still fully appreciating, managed to organize and execute one of the most ambitious construction projects in human history, and left behind a written record detailed enough that we can still read one ordinary supervisor's daily notes about it, nearly 5,000 years later. If deep dives like this into how ancient civilizations actually accomplished the impossible keep you hooked, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.